He did not recognize me. That was the part that rattled me most, far more than the slick presentation deck with my stolen code, or the fact that he called it proprietary in-house tech. I stood there, 4 rows back in the dim, cold auditorium at the Cloud Technology Summit, watching Bradley Thorne, the same man who once spilled expensive single malt whiskey on my split mechanical keyboard and told me to take the replacement cost out of my personal feelings budget, parade my custom database algorithm like a show pony. Bradley was 39 years old, polished by venture capital consultants, and wore his supreme arrogance like expensive designer cologne. He stood in front of a giant high-definition screen, showing a slide of my core architecture, and when his eyes swept over the crowded room and met mine, there was not even a flicker of recognition or guilt, just that same plastic smirk he used when presenting to venture capitalists. He did not know who I was. I stood there invisible in the shadow of my own software legacy, feeling like a ghost watching someone else live my life. He clicked to slide 6, my slide 6, and I felt my throat close up. Not because of the blatant theft, as that was old news, but because of the specific line of code frozen on the screen behind him. Line 208. It was a log comment that read SLV2 optimization after Montreal crash AMR. Those initials belonged to my grandmother, Abigail Marie Roberts, who had taught me the beauty of mathematical logic before she passed away. I had left them there 7 years ago in a moment of quiet pride, like carving your name into a tree you did not own. Bradley had not scrubbed it, he had not even noticed, or maybe he had and simply did not care because he assumed I would never have the courage to speak up. That was what finally broke something inside me. Let us go back 7 years. They hired me out of a technology hackathon in Seattle that I had only attended to escape the heavy quiet of my empty apartment. I was 35 years old back then, a seasoned systems architect who had spent nearly 2 decades debugging legacy databases and building scaling engines for software companies that went bankrupt before their stock options ever vested. I was tired, slightly cynical, but still possessed a deep obsessive love for the pure elegance of clean systems. The recruiters at Juno Cloud pitched me a beautiful dream. They talked about disruptive technology, horizontal growth, and a flat hierarchy where everyone was treated like family. What they actually meant was they needed a veteran engineer to build the heavy engine of their cloud platform, underpay him, and work him until he forgot the sound of his own voice. And I did just that. For 7 years, I worked like I was building the foundation of a digital empire. My days were 14 hours long and the weekends blurred into late-night server deployments. But I loved the problem I was solving. I was building a distributed load balancing efficiency engine for hybrid cloud environments, something that could scale better than anything else on the market. When I finally ran it on our staging servers and watched latency drop by 52%, I actually sat back in my chair and stared at the terminal in silence for a long time. We named the product Ether, and it became the crown jewel of Juno Cloud. The executives made millions, while I received stock options that eventually matured into worthless dust. At first, I stayed quiet. I told myself I was building equity and clout, that eventually the corporate meritocracy would catch up with my contribution. But meritocracy, as I eventually learned, is just a polite word for executive managers taking credit while senior engineers debug their garbage. The tipping point was not a massive conflict, but a simple dismissive laugh. One afternoon, I walked into Bradley's glass office and asked for a raise. I did not even ask for equity or a fancy new vice president title, just a base salary that matched the market value of what my code was generating for the firm. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair, crossed his arms, and laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, the kind of laugh people use when they think you have zero leverage. He told me that I was not really the negotiating type, Daniel. He said that I was technical, that this was my lane, and that I should focus on keeping the servers running instead of worrying about the business metrics. I remember the dry, bitter taste in my mouth, like I had swallowed the ashes of my younger self. That was the moment something shifted inside my mind. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or threaten to quit. I just smiled, the quiet, calm smile that people often mistake for compliance, and walked out of his office. I did not plan to quit, at least not yet. I had something far better in mind. What Bradley and the rest of the executive team did not know was that I still owned the core patent for the load balancing algorithm, not Juno Cloud, me, and that was where their long slide into the abyss began. The patent was my hidden card, tucked so deep in my sleeve that I had almost forgotten it was there. 7 years ago, during the very early prototype stage of Ether, I had filed the utility patent myself. I did it quietly under my previous legal name, utilizing a semi-retired patent lawyer from Santa Clara named Harold. Harold was a sharp old man who smelled of aged paper and cheap bourbon. He looked at my documentation, looked me in the eyes, and told me that the specific claims we were drafting would act as a bulletproof vest if the company ever tried to push me out. I paid his fees in monthly installments, living on cheap instant noodles for half a year to afford it. It was worth every single sacrifice. Juno Cloud never questioned the patent situation because the founders were too busy branding, chasing venture capital, and printing glossy marketing brochures. By the time they integrated my algorithm into the core architecture of Ether, they treated it like oxygen, essential, invisible, and completely free. But now, that algorithm was their entire product, their sole competitive advantage, and the foundation of their $90 million valuation. I held the trigger to their entire business model, but I chose not to pull it immediately. I played the long game. I showed up to work every single morning, did my job, and pretended the laugh in Bradley's office had not fractured something permanent within me. Harold's office was situated on the second floor of a concrete building that overlooked an old parking lot. It was filled with mountains of paper, legal volumes bound in leather, and a vintage typewriter that sat on his walnut desk. He told me that technology companies were notorious for treating engineers as disposable units of production, and that, unless I secured the underlying patent, I would eventually find myself cast aside when the business scaling reached its plateau. He spent 3 hours helping me refine the description of the telemetry routing loops, ensuring we described the logic in terms of mathematical data streams rather than specific programming languages. This abstract language made the patent incredibly robust because it covered any translation of the logic into Python, C++, or Go. Meanwhile, I began auditing our production codebase line by line. I kept a private repository on an isolated home server, creating a timestamped, cryptically annotated mirror of our production environments. I documented every single instance where my patented algorithm was deployed, modified, or extended by other engineers. I collected evidence of how they had built their entire infrastructure on top of intellectual property like squatters. Building a mansion on stolen land. Then came phase 2, which was my Trojan horse. I introduced a new debugging and metrics module to the staging environment, pitching it to the team as an internal monitoring tool to track cluster behavior and identify routing bottlenecks in real time. The engineering team cheered because it made their lives easier. Bradley, in his typical technical ignorance, called me a genius in our weekly meeting and approved the deployment to production without reading a single line of the architecture notes. Inside that module was a simple, lightweight telemetry heartbeat. Every time the core load balancing algorithm executed, it sent an anonymized, encrypted metadata packet to my private home server. It was not espionage, it was simple system telemetry, and it was entirely legal under our current internal usage policy. Thanks to that heartbeat, I knew exactly when, where, and how often my algorithm was being utilized. By the end of April, it was powering every single transaction across their global network. The metrics module recorded the system load, the memory footprint of each active database thread, and the exact timestamp of every routing request. It compiled this information into an encrypted hexadecimal log file that was transmitted back to my home server every hour. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, completely unobtrusive, consuming less than a fraction of a percent of the system memory. I watched the logs populate, seeing my algorithm process millions of concurrent connections from corporate clients in London, Tokyo, and New York. I realized that my code was the silent heartbeat of their entire infrastructure, yet salary remained locked at the same level it was when I first joined the company. Once my dossier was complete, it totaled 78 pages of precise, unassailable evidence, It contained execution timestamps, comparative network benchmarks, and clear diagrams showing how Ether was built entirely on my patented claims. I sealed the document and prepared to deliver it to the one person Bradley Thorne feared more than anyone else in the tech sector, Preston Crane. Preston was the billionaire founder and chief executive officer of Vortex Technologies, Juno Cloud's largest and most aggressive competitor. We had met once at a technology conference years ago where we had shared a brief conversation about server optimization. He had handed me his card and told me to call him if my employers ever forgot who actually built the engine they were riding. I had kept that card in the bottom drawer of my desk for 7 years. I called his office on a Thursday morning, and within 2 minutes of explaining what I had, his executive assistant put him on the line. He did not waste time with small talk. He simply asked me how badly they had treated me and how soon I could send the files. I sent him the dossier in 3 encrypted parts. He read the entire document before sunrise the next day, and by Monday morning, I was sitting in a conference room at Vortex Technologies. By Friday, their legal team had finalized the purchase of my patent, transferring the intellectual property directly to Vortex Technologies. I sat back and waited for the corporate sky to fall on Juno Cloud. It began with a minor bug report from one of Juno Cloud's largest enterprise accounts, a slight routing anomaly during their peak load cycle. The on-call engineers flagged it as a routine issue and scheduled a fix for the next development sprint. I smiled when I saw the ticket because I knew that anomaly was not a bug. It was the first tremor before the volcanic eruption. Once Vortex Technologies acquired the patent, their legal department did not hesitate. They drafted a 30-page cease and desist letter filled with icy, legal precision, detailing the exact patent claims Juno Cloud was violating under Title 35 of the United States Code, Section 271, along with a demand for immediate cessation of all Ether-based services. Bradley Thorne received the letter on a Monday morning. I know because a junior engineer on the back-end team sent me a screenshot of Bradley, pacing frantically in front of his whiteboard, having drawn a risk diagram and underlined it 7 times in red ink. By noon, emergency meetings were being called every 15 minutes. By the afternoon, their vice president of legal affairs had quietly resigned, realizing the company had zero defense. But I was not just watching from the sidelines. 2 weeks prior to the patent sale, I had requested a transfer to our legacy support division, a move Bradley had happily approved because he thought he was punishing me by putting me on outdated systems. The legacy support division was a quiet graveyard of obsolete database systems and neglected applications that the company had long abandoned. It was located on the basement level of our office building, a place where the lights hummed constantly and the air conditioning was always too cold. While the rest of the engineering team was running around the upper floors trying to address the legal crisis, I spent my days copying internal archives, transaction histories, and project documentation onto an encrypted solid-state drive. I gathered years of emails showing that Bradley Thorne had explicitly requested status reports on the load balancing algorithm, proving beyond any shadow of doubt that he was fully aware of the code's origins and its performance metrics. What he had actually done was give me low-profile access to internal infrastructure that nobody was monitoring. While the executive team panicked over the legal threat, I quietly archived our internal documentation, download logs, and communications. I knew their first reaction would be to lie, to claim they had developed the technology independently, and to gaslight the industry. But I had the receipts, and I kept them safe on my personal storage. When Bradley called an all-hands meeting that Thursday and announced there was a minor misunderstanding regarding some intellectual property, I had to force myself not to laugh out loud. He called it a misunderstanding, yet he had built a $90 million company on technology he did not own. The engineering team was terrified, asking if we were going to refactor the entire Ether codebase. Bradley waved them off, claiming legal was handling the dispute and that nothing would change. But everything was already changing. Vortex Technologies went public with their new platform, which was powered by my optimized algorithm, supercharged by their superior infrastructure. Juno Cloud's clients saw the patent news, smelled the blood in the water, and began canceling their contracts. Within a week, 5 major enterprise accounts jumped ship to Vortex Technologies, and one of them posted a detailed breakdown of the legal battle on social media. The defection of the enterprise accounts was a massive blow to Juno Cloud's financial health. These clients were the primary source of their recurring revenue, and their sudden departure caused a panic among our primary investors. Vortex Technologies was offering them a seamless migration process, moving their entire operations onto their new Vortex AI platform in less than 48 hours. Bradley tried to organize an emergency development workshop, ordering the back-end engineers to replace the load balancing algorithm with a basic open-source routing library. But the open-source library could not handle the concurrent database connection requests, and the staging environments crashed repeatedly under minimal test loads. Bradley tried to patch the sinking ship with desperate promises. He ordered the remaining engineers to rewrite the core load-balancing logic, not understanding that any rewrite would still violate the patent unless they completely redesigned the system architecture from the ground up, a task that would take at least 18 months that they did not have. Finally, he summoned me to his glass office. He looked smaller, his face pale and his eyes red from lack of sleep. He addressed me as Daniel, omitting the casual nicknames he usually used to assert dominance. He told me he needed my help, that the company was facing a temporary hurdle, and that I was the only one who understood the codebase well enough to guide them through a rapid refactoring process. I sat down, crossed my legs, let the silence stretch between us for 10 seconds, and told him that he was confusing me with someone who actually cared about his survival. He blinked, stunned by my tone. He tried to offer me a seat at the table, a promotion to senior architect, and a significant block of equity. I looked at him, stood up, and told him that he had my loyalty for 7 years, and he had thrown it away for an executive bonus and a temporary slide deck. I walked out of his office, leaving him alone in his empty glass tower. The first wave of layoffs hit the following Friday, sweeping away 31 employees, including Gary Higgins, a quiet back-end developer who brought his senior rescue dog to the office and worked diligently without ever complaining. I watched from the break room as Gary packed his desk, whispering comfort to his dog while the rest of the floor remained frozen in terror. Nobody looked at me, not out of anger, but out of that quiet, primitive instinct people develop around ticking bombs. I had become a cautionary tale with a badge. I was not laid off, however, because Bradley was still desperately trying to find a way to save his career. The day after the layoffs, I received a calendar invite for a private meeting in his office. I arrived 10 minutes early and stood in the hallway, listening as Bradley spoke to someone on the phone. He was arguing that I was bluffing, that I would never destroy 7 years of my own work because my ego was too wrapped up in the codebase. I smiled to myself. Bradley had always mistaken a man's pride in his craft for a desire to be exploited. When he finally let me in, the corporate theater was gone. There were no friendly smiles or talk of family. There was only a desperate manager offering me a massive salary increase, a vice president title, and a performance-based bonus package that would have changed my life 3 years ago. Gary Higgins had been with the company for 3 years, quietly maintaining the database wrappers that Ether relied on. He was a veteran of the industry himself, a man who had seen his share of startups collapse and knew the signs long before the axe fell. The atmosphere in the open plan office was suffocating, filled with the sound of quiet conversations in the corridors and the rustle of cardboard boxes as people packed up their belongings. The human resources team was escorting people out of the building, one by one, accompanied by security guards who stood near the elevators with their arms crossed. I sat at my desk, looking at my terminal screen, feeling the weight of the collective anxiety in the room. The catch was the stack of legal documents sliding across his desk, an NDA so restrictive it would have barred me from speaking about my own work for a decade, accompanied by a non-compete clause that covered 3 continents. He wanted me to sign my silence away so they could bury the truth and pretend they had resolved the dispute through standard licensing. I turned to the signature page, looked at the empty line, and asked him if he honestly believed I would sign my own collar. He tried to convince me that we could move forward, that this was the best outcome for everyone. I stood up, left the unsigned packet on the table, and walked out of the building for the last time. That night, Vortex Technologies made their final play. They did not file for standard damages. Instead, they shared the story with a prominent technology news outlet. The headline was a front-page feature about how Juno Cloud had erased the veteran architect who built their core technology, featuring a photograph of me standing in front of a whiteboard, covered in my load-balancing equations. The media did not use flattering filters. They left the deep lines under my eyes and the gray in my beard, presenting me exactly as I was. An exhausted engineer who had finally taken back his power. The NDA was a masterpiece of corporate self-defense, designed to erase my very existence from the history of the company. It contained clauses that would have penalized me hundreds of thousands of dollars if I ever publicly admitted to building the Ether architecture or discussed the patent transfer with industry publications. It was clear that Bradley Thorne was terrified of the impending news story. Knowing that his reputation as a technical visionary would be completely destroyed if the truth became public knowledge. He stood near the window, staring out at the gray Seattle skyline, waiting for my response with a tense, forced smile. Juno Cloud's stock value plummeted by 26% by the next morning. Investors panicked, and the Securities and Exchange Commission opened an official inquiry into the company's public disclosures regarding their intellectual property. By noon, Bradley Thorne was placed on administrative leave, and by the evening, his social media profiles showed he was looking for work. Yet, as I watched the company collapse, I did not feel a rush of triumph. I felt a deep, quiet sense of relief, like I had finally cleaned the dust of 7 years of corporate exploitation out of my lungs. Lock, stock, and barrel, the empire was dissolving, but the battle was not over. The chief executive officer, Catherine Shields, had remained throughout the public scandal, but she was a powerful player with deep connections in the venture capital world. She was the one who had approved Bradley's decisions, and she was not about to let her career end without a fight. The next morning, I received an official email from the Human Resources Department, claiming that their internal security systems had detected suspicious data transfers from my credentials prior to my departure. It was a clear threat, a shot fired from the shadows to paint me as a thief who had siphoned proprietary data. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because I knew exactly what Catherine Shields was trying to do. She was trying to shift the narrative, to turn me from a victim of corporate theft into a disgruntled employee who had sabotaged his company. Within hours of the email, anonymous threads began appearing on online forums, spreading rumors about a rogue developer who had weaponized system metrics to blackmail executive managers. They posted an old photo of me pacing the office hallway during a 62-hour deployment crash, labeling me as an unstable engineer who could not be trusted. The industry was quick to consume the drama, finding it easier to believe a narrative about an unstable developer than to admit the corporate leadership had built a house of cards on stolen labor. The next day, I received a phone call from Nadia Pierce, an old friend from my university days who now worked as a principal investigator for a prominent digital forensics firm. Nadia did not waste time. She told me my name was appearing in internal security logs that were being circulated among industry recruiters, and she wanted to know the exact truth of what I had done. I walked her through my system modifications, explaining the heartbeat telemetry and the mirrored repository. The anonymous accounts on Reddit were posting detailed timelines that had been carefully fabricated by someone inside Juno Cloud's marketing department. They claimed that I had installed a malicious backdoor in the production database and that my departure was a direct result of being caught in an act of corporate espionage. The online tech forums were filled with threads analyzing my old contributions on GitHub, with anonymous posters claiming that my coding style was unstable and prone to failure. It was an organized smear campaign designed to destroy my professional reputation before I could secure a new position at a competitor firm. Nadia listened in silence, then told me that while my actions were technically legal, Juno Cloud's IT department had staged a data export to a sandbox environment using my old credentials, backdating the logs to make it appear as though I had stolen proprietary architecture files before I left. but they had made a critical technical error. Because of a minor time zone mismatch in their database configuration, the timestamps on the staged export did not align with my actual login records. Nadia helped me trace the digital footprint, documenting the fabrication and certifying the evidence. We compiled a 410-page counter dossier that proved the company had fabricated the security breach to defame me. Vortex Technologies' legal team delivered the document directly to the board of directors with a clear warning. If the defamation did not cease immediately, we would file a public lawsuit for corporate fraud and retaliation. The board acted within 48 hours. Catherine Shields quietly resigned from her position, her exit package canceled, and the company issued a private letter of apology to my legal counsel. Juno Cloud's assets were eventually liquidated, and their core technology was absorbed by Vortex Technologies. Nadia and I spent 12 hours analyzing the network metadata in her forensics laboratory, comparing the database logs side by side. The database was configured to run on Universal Coordinated Time, but the staged data export had been recorded using Pacific Standard Time, creating an impossible 8-hour discrepancy in the transaction sequences. It was a classic administrative mistake, the kind of oversight that occurs when a non-technical manager tries to direct a technical cover-up under intense pressure. We documented the error in a certified report, sealing it with cryptographic signatures to ensure it could not be altered. A few days later, I received an email from Julian Mercer, the chief technology officer of a fast-growing intelligence firm called NovaQuint. Julian was a smart strategist who had watched the entire public battle unfold. He offered me a position as the director of an autonomous engineering division, complete with a high salary, full ownership of my future patents, and a promise that no executives would ever interfere with my work. It was a tempting offer, the kind of role I had spent my entire career chasing. But as I stared at the screen, I realized that Julian did not want a partner. He wanted a weapon that had proven it could destroy its targets. I declined the offer with a single sentence, choosing instead to open a blank text document on my screen. I started writing code for an open-source systems platform that I named Mirror. I built it without venture capital, without business managers, and without the hollow promise of a corporate family. Within 3 days of releasing the beta version, it became the top trending project on GitHub, with hundreds of independent developers contributing to the codebase. I still drink black coffee, and I still write code at 2 in the morning in the quiet of my study. But now, I own every single keystroke.